For more than half a century, the memory refused to fade. Across the towns, monasteries, and fortified settlements of Poland, stories still lingered of an earlier catastrophe. Older men spoke of villages burned to their foundations. Clergymen copied accounts of cities consumed by fire. Noble families preserved memories of fathers and grandfathers who had vanished beneath clouds of arrows fired by riders who seemed capable of appearing and disappearing like shadows across the horizon. The year was 2088, but the terror began decades earlier. In 1241, the Mongols had shattered much of Central Europe's confidence in its own security. Their armies had crossed enormous distances with astonishing speed, destroying kingdoms and principalities that had believed themselves protected by geography, walls, or tradition. Poland had been among the first victims. The defeat at Legnica remained embedded in collective memory. The Mongols had demonstrated a style of warfare unlike anything many European commanders had encountered before. They moved faster than conventional armies. They relied on intelligence gathering, deception, and mobility. Their commanders understood how to manipulate fear as effectively as they used swords or bows. Entire regions learned a harsh lesson. A castle could not defend a countryside if its defenders never managed to concentrate. A brave cavalry charge meant little if the enemy refused battle until the moment of his choosing. Even numerical superiority could become meaningless when armies were divided, confused, and drawn apart. The Mongols understood this. Again and again across Eurasia, they had destroyed opponents not merely by fighting them, but by controlling their decisions. Fear became a weapon. By the late 13th century, however, the political landscape of Eastern Europe was changing. Poland remained fragmented into competing duchies, but its rulers had gained valuable experience. Decades had passed since the first invasion. Survivors had studied what happened. Fortifications had improved. Local commanders had become more familiar with steppe warfare. Most importantly, the psychological shock that once paralyzed resistance had begun to fade. The Mongols were still feared. But fear alone no longer guaranteed victory. Far to the east, the immense empire forged by the descendants of Genghis Khan had also changed. What had once been a unified machine now consisted of competing successor states. Ambitious princes, rival khans, and regional commanders increasingly pursued their own objectives. The Western Mongol domains, often known collectively as the Golden Horde, remained powerful. Their cavalry armies still possessed extraordinary mobility. Their reputation remained formidable. Yet cracks had appeared beneath the surface. Political disputes consumed attention. Resources were divided. Campaigns increasingly served regional ambitions, rather than the unified expansion that had characterized earlier generations. None of this made the Mongols weak, but it did mean that future invasions would occur under different circumstances. In 1287 and 1288, another major expedition moved toward Poland. The objectives were familiar. Plunder remained an important motivation. Demonstrating power also mattered. Maintaining influence over frontier regions required periodic campaigns capable of reminding neighboring rulers that Mongol military strength remained very real. For the communities lying in the invasion's path, however, strategic calculations mattered little. What they saw was danger approaching once again from the east. The winter landscape offered little comfort. Snow-covered fields and forests. Rivers froze beneath the cold. Roads became difficult, but not impossible. For steppe cavalry accustomed to harsh conditions, winter campaigns could provide advantages. Frozen ground allowed rapid movement. Agricultural populations found it harder to relocate supplies or seek refuge. As reports spread through border regions, uncertainty followed. Nobody knew exactly where the main Mongol columns would strike. Nobody knew how large the invading force truly was. Rumors traveled faster than facts. One village claimed thousands had crossed the frontier. Another reported entire regions already burning. Messengers arrived carrying fragments of information gathered from merchants, scouts, and travelers. Some reports contradicted one another. Others exaggerated what had been seen. But a single reality remained constant. The Mongols were coming. For Polish leaders, the challenge was not simply military. It was psychological. They needed to avoid repeating the mistakes that had doomed earlier defenders. The temptation during a fast-moving invasion was always the same. Every threatened settlement demanded immediate assistance. Every raid appeared urgent. Every report seemed to require action. Yet the Mongols often relied upon exactly this reaction. When defenders scattered in multiple directions, they became vulnerable. Local victories achieved by the invaders created confusion. Communication broke down. Forces that might have resisted effectively together instead fought separately and were destroyed one after another. Experienced commanders understood the danger. Discipline would matter more than emotion. Patience would matter more than pride. The rulers of the Polish duchies therefore faced a difficult decision. Allowing enemy raiders freedom of movement carried political risks. Local populations expected protection. Nobles demanded action. Clergy prayed for deliverance while simultaneously urging rulers to defend Christian lands. Pressure mounted quickly, yet assembling a coordinated response required time. Time was exactly what fast-moving Mongol operations attempted to deny their enemies. Throughout the frontier regions, scouts watched roads and river crossings. Castle garrisons prepared supplies. Signal systems stood ready. Messengers rode through forests and frozen countryside, carrying instructions from one stronghold to another. The atmosphere was tense but different from the panic of earlier decades. Memories of disaster still existed, but so did memories of lessons learned. Among the most important was a simple recognition. The Mongols were not invincible. They could be resisted. They could be delayed. Under the right circumstances, they could even be defeated. Achieving such an outcome required understanding how they fought. The Mongol way of war depended heavily upon mobility and initiative. Commanders preferred to dictate tempo. They preferred opponents who reacted rather than planned. Every successful campaign reinforced the same principle. Keep the enemy uncertain. Keep him moving. Keep him divided. Then strike where resistance is weakest. Polish leaders increasingly recognized that surviving meant reversing this equation. Instead of chasing every raid, they needed concentration. Instead of emotional reactions, they needed coordination. Instead of allowing the invaders to choose the battlefield, they needed opportunities to shape events themselves. This was easier to describe than accomplish. Winter weather complicated communication. Political fragmentation complicated cooperation. Personal rivalries complicated command decisions. Even when leaders agreed upon broad objectives, implementing them across multiple territories remained difficult. Meanwhile, the Mongol advance continued. Riders crossed frontier regions. Raiding parties spread outward. Smoke rose from isolated settlements. The familiar pattern of disruption began to unfold, yet beneath the surface, something unusual was developing. The invaders expected fear. They expected confusion. They expected the defensive system to fracture under pressure. Instead, many Polish commanders displayed greater restraint than their predecessors had shown nearly 50 years earlier. They watched. They gathered information. They avoided committing major forces prematurely. Most importantly, they sought to understand the true direction of the campaign before risking decisive action. The contrast would prove significant. For generations, Mongol success had often depended upon forcing opponents into predictable responses. Now they faced defenders increasingly aware of that reality. The coming confrontation would therefore become more than a simple clash of armies. It would become a contest of judgment, a struggle between commanders attempting to impose their own logic upon a chaotic battlefield. One side carried a reputation forged across continents. The other carried memories of humiliation that had never been forgotten. As winter deepened across the Polish countryside, both sides moved toward a collision neither fully controlled. Scouts disappeared into forests. Messengers rode through frozen nights. Fortified towns prepared for siege. Noble cavalry assembled under regional banners, and somewhere beyond the frontier, Mongol commanders advanced with confidence born from generations of success, unaware that the defenders ahead were preparing something different from the frightened resistance their predecessors had encountered decades before. The trap had not yet been sprung, but the conditions that would make it possible were already taking shape. As the winter campaign unfolded, the invading force pushed deeper into Polish territory. The commanders leading the expedition were not reckless raiders wandering without purpose. They belonged to a military tradition that had dominated vast portions of Eurasia for generations. Their methods had been refined through countless campaigns against kingdoms, principalities, nomadic confederations, and fortified cities stretching from China to Eastern Europe. Every movement reflected experience. Mongol warfare relied upon flexibility rather than rigid plans. Commanders expected conditions to change rapidly. Scouts operated far ahead of the main force, gathering information about roads, settlements, rivers, supplies, and enemy concentrations. Decisions were often based upon intelligence collected only hours earlier. The army itself was designed for mobility. Most warriors maintained multiple horses, allowing them to preserve endurance over long distances. Units could separate and reunite with remarkable speed. Messages moved quickly through established command structures. Even when spread across broad regions, Mongol forces frequently retained a level of coordination that astonished their opponents. Their greatest strength remained uncertainty. Enemies rarely knew where the main attack would fall. A column observed in one valley might appear somewhere entirely different days later. A retreat could conceal an ambush. A small raid might serve merely as a distraction, while larger forces maneuvered elsewhere. This style of warfare had repeatedly overwhelmed European armies that relied upon slower communication and more rigid methods of deployment. But by 2088, Poland was no longer facing the unknown. The generation confronting the invasion had inherited painful lessons. Across the duchies, local rulers recognized that chasing Mongol detachments across the countryside would play directly into enemy hands. Instead, they focused on preserving their strength while monitoring the invaders' movements. The most important weapon available to the defenders was information. Scouts moved constantly through forests and frozen fields. Monasteries relayed reports. Castle commanders exchanged intelligence. Messengers rode through dangerous territory carrying fragments of a larger picture that gradually became clearer with each passing day. The invading army was moving aggressively, but it was also becoming increasingly dispersed. This dispersion was not necessarily a mistake. Mongol commanders often divided forces during campaigns to maximize speed and gather supplies. Multiple columns could raid simultaneously, spreading panic across a wider area, while forcing defenders to remain uncertain about the enemy's true intentions. For decades, such methods had proven devastating. Yet every military strength carries hidden vulnerabilities. The farther individual detachments moved from one another, the more difficult mutual support became. Distance that created flexibility could also create isolation. Polish commanders watched carefully. Rather than responding to every attack, they searched for opportunities. The winter landscape itself began influencing decisions on both sides. The terrain of southern Poland differed significantly from the open grasslands that had shaped traditional Mongol warfare. Dense forests interrupted visibility. Marshlands, though partially frozen, still complicated movement. River crossings created bottlenecks. Narrow routes limited maneuverability. None of these obstacles made Mongol operations impossible, but they reduced some of the advantages that steppe cavalry typically enjoyed on open terrain. The weather added another layer of difficulty. Winter campaigns placed tremendous demands upon logistics. Horses required forage. Men required food and shelter. Maintaining operational momentum became increasingly challenging as distances grew. The invaders continued forward, but the campaign was becoming more complicated than expected. Meanwhile, Polish forces gradually concentrated. The process occurred cautiously. Commanders understood that assembling a large army too early could allow Mongol scouts to detect their intentions. They needed enough strength to fight effectively while preserving uncertainty regarding their actual positions. Patience became a strategic asset. For soldiers waiting inside fortified positions, however, patience was not easy. Reports of raids continued arriving. Farmsteads burned. Livestock disappeared. Families sought refuge behind walls. Many warriors undoubtedly felt the urge to ride out immediately and confront the enemy. Such emotions were understandable, but military success often depends upon resisting immediate impulses. The defenders remembered what had happened when armies rushed into battle without sufficient preparation. The shadow of 2041 remained present in every calculation. That memory encouraged caution. As days passed, a clearer pattern emerged. Certain Mongol detachments appeared increasingly confident. Resistance had been limited. Many settlements remained vulnerable. The campaign seemed to be following familiar expectations. From the invaders' perspective, the defenders appeared hesitant, perhaps fragmented, perhaps intimidated, perhaps unwilling to risk major engagement. Such conclusions would prove dangerous. The reality developing behind the front lines was very different. Polish leaders were not paralyzed, they were waiting. The distinction mattered enormously. Eventually, circumstances began creating the opportunity they had sought. One Mongol force advanced into an area where local geography restricted movement. Forests narrowed approaches. Settlements and defensive positions offered observation points. Communication between separate raiding elements became less reliable. For the defenders, these conditions presented possibilities. The objective was not merely to fight. It was to fight under favorable circumstances. This represented a fundamental shift in mindset. Earlier generations often found themselves reacting to Mongol initiatives. Now Polish commanders sought to impose their own conditions upon the conflict. They understood they could not match the invaders in mobility across open terrain. They did not need to. Instead, they needed to identify moments when mobility became less decisive. The planning that followed reflected growing military maturity. Scouts confirmed enemy locations. Routes of movement were analyzed. Potential concentration points were identified. Commanders coordinated across regional boundaries more effectively than many Mongol leaders expected. The process remained imperfect. Medieval warfare always involved uncertainty. Information arrived late, weather disrupted communication, enemy movements remained difficult to predict. Yet compared to earlier invasions, the defensive response displayed noticeably greater cohesion. As preparations continued, tension increased among the men who would soon face battle. Most soldiers possessed only limited understanding of the broader strategy. They knew the enemy's reputation. They knew stories passed down from fathers and grandfathers. Some likely wondered whether those terrifying legends had exaggerated reality. Others feared the stories had not gone far enough. The psychological burden was significant. Few opponents inspired as much dread as the Mongols. Their victories had become almost mythical. Yet myths often begin to weaken when confronted by experience. Every successful defense, every failed raid, every surviving community. Each chipped away at the aura of inevitability surrounding Mongol conquest. The defenders entering battle carried both fear and determination. The invaders carried confidence supported by generations of success. These opposing psychological forces moved steadily toward confrontation. At last, the campaign approached its critical phase. Polish forces began positioning themselves for action. Concentrations occurred near routes likely to be used by advancing Mongol detachments. Terrain features were carefully considered. Forest edges, frozen streams, and settlement approaches all influenced deployment decisions. Unlike dramatic depictions, often presented in later centuries, medieval battles rarely unfolded according to perfectly scripted plans. Commanders worked with probabilities rather than certainty. They created opportunities. Then they attempted to exploit them before circumstances changed. The approaching engagement would be no different. The first signs appeared through increased scout activity. Reports became more frequent. Enemy movements were tracked with growing precision. Messenger traffic intensified. Orders spread through camps and strongholds. Units prepared equipment. Horses were readied. Weapons inspected. The waiting period was ending. Somewhere ahead, Mongol detachments continued advancing, unaware of the scale of coordination developing against them. The invaders believed they were operating inside familiar patterns. Raid. Disperse. Intimidate. Maintain initiative. Force the defenders to react. Instead, the defenders were preparing to reverse the equation. The battlefield itself would not be defined by a single open plain or a neatly arranged clash of armies. It would emerge from a series of movements, decisions, and misjudgments. The crucial factor was timing. Strike too early, and the Mongols might escape. Strike too late, and the opportunity could vanish entirely. Everything depended upon recognizing the precise moment when confidence became vulnerability. That moment was approaching. As frozen winds swept across the Polish countryside and daylight faded early beneath winter skies, both armies moved toward a confrontation that would challenge assumptions formed over decades. For the Mongols, another successful campaign appeared within reach. For the defenders, a rare opportunity was beginning to reveal itself. The battlefield trap that had been forming through patience, intelligence, and discipline was almost ready. Soon, the initiative that Mongol commanders had relied upon for generations would begin slipping from their hands. And once that happened, the campaign would enter a far more dangerous phase than anyone on the invading side expected. The decisive phase of the campaign did not begin with a single dramatic charge. It began with a quiet but powerful shift in momentum. For generations, Mongol commanders had mastered the art of forcing their enemies into reactive positions. They controlled the pace of war. They decided when to strike, when to withdraw, and where pressure would fall. Their opponents often found themselves chasing shadows, unable to predict movements or respond effectively. But in the winter of 2088, something changed. The familiar pattern began to break. The Mongol forces entered Poland expecting the same results they had achieved many times before. Their raiding units advanced confidently. Scouts moved ahead, searching for weak points. Commanders assumed that resistance would be scattered, disorganized, and fearful. However, beneath this expectation, a different reality had taken shape. Polish forces had learned from the past. Instead of reacting blindly to every raid, they remained disciplined. They avoided unnecessary pursuits and focused on maintaining unity. Their strength was not in reckless bravery, but in coordination and patience. At first, this change was not obvious, but slowly it began to affect the battlefield. As Mongol units moved deeper into regions filled with forests, rivers, and narrow paths, their formations became stretched. The distance between different groups increased. What once gave them flexibility now created vulnerability. Support could not arrive quickly. Communication became slower and less reliable. Scouts could no longer see everything clearly. The open steppe, where Mongols thrived, was gone. In its place stood terrain that limited movement and visibility. Polish commanders understood this advantage. Instead of attacking the strongest Mongol forces, they targeted weaker, isolated units. This was not just a tactical decision, it was psychological warfare. The Mongol system depended heavily on confidence. Their success relied on the belief that they controlled every situation. Once doubt entered their ranks, their effectiveness began to weaken. And that is exactly what the Polish forces aimed to create. As clashes increased, small battles erupted across the frozen landscape. Scouts encountered resistance. Raiding parties faced unexpected opposition. Movement became difficult and contested. The rhythm of the campaign began to shift. At first, Mongol leaders did not see this as a major threat. They had faced resistance before and overcome it. Experienced commanders knew that war rarely followed a perfect plan. But there was a problem. They were no longer receiving clear information. Reports from different areas began to conflict. Some units reported easy movement. Others described growing enemy strength. Some routes became dangerous and unpredictable. The battlefield no longer behaved as expected. This confusion created the perfect opportunity for the defenders. At a crucial moment, Polish forces launched coordinated attacks that surprised the Mongols. Historical records from this period are incomplete, but the overall pattern is clear. Mongol units found themselves facing organized resistance in unfavorable conditions. What began as small engagements quickly turned into serious confrontations. Pressure increased. Polish forces committed more troops. The Mongols faced an enemy that had learned from past defeats. Instead of falling into traps, Polish soldiers stayed disciplined. They used terrain wisely. They avoided being divided and focused their strength on isolated enemy units. The impact was gradual but powerful. Each successful defense increased pressure on the Mongols. Each disruption reduced their mobility. Each setback created more uncertainty. Military collapse rarely happens in a single moment. It builds step by step. A failed action leads to confusion. Confusion delays communication. Delayed communication causes poor decisions. Poor decisions lead to further losses. Eventually, the entire system begins to weaken. This process had begun. As resistance grew stronger, Mongol advantages became harder to use. Their mounted archers needed space. Their speed required safe routes. Their strategy depended on clear communication. All of these were now compromised. Meanwhile, Polish forces gained confidence. Success encouraged better coordination. Units that once hesitated now acted boldly. For the first time in decades, something remarkable was happening. The fear that once belonged to the defenders was shifting. For years, stories of Mongol destruction had terrified Eastern Europe. Now, soldiers who grew up hearing those stories were witnessing something different. They saw Mongol forces retreat. They saw enemy plans fail. They saw fear change sides. For the Mongols, this was dangerous. Armies rely heavily on belief. An army that expects victory fights differently than one that senses defeat. Confidence keeps discipline strong. But once confidence fades, even experienced warriors struggle. The harsh winter made everything worse. Cold slowed movement. Supplies became harder to manage. Distances felt longer. Mistakes became more costly. What began as a powerful invasion was turning into a difficult struggle. Eventually, Mongol commanders understood the situation. Their objectives had not been achieved. The defenders had not collapsed. The expected pattern of quick success had failed. Continuing forward was too risky. They had to withdraw, but retreat was dangerous. Advancing armies control momentum. Retreating armies face constant threats, ambush, pursuit, and falling morale. Polish forces did not allow them to leave easily. Pressure continued. Harassment increased. The Mongols faced growing difficulties as they tried to escape. This was no longer the image of an unstoppable force. Instead, it was a campaign that had gone wrong. The failure had lasting consequences. It showed that Poland had changed. Despite political divisions, military improvement was clear. Leaders had learned from past disasters. Defense systems worked better. Cooperation increased when needed. Most importantly, fear no longer controlled every decision. This was a major achievement. Throughout history, reputation plays a powerful role in war. Armies win because enemies believe they cannot be defeated. Breaking that belief requires proof. The events of 1288 provided that proof. The Mongols were still strong. They remained one of the most powerful forces of their time. But they were no longer seen as unstoppable. They could be resisted. They could fail. This changed how others viewed them. The campaign also reflected changes within the Mongol world. Their era of rapid expansion was slowing. Internal conflicts grew. Resources were stretched. Unity weakened. The invasion did not end Mongol power. The Golden Horde remained influential. But the balance of power was shifting. Local rulers adapted. Defenses improved. Fear began to fade. Looking back, the importance of this campaign is not just in battles fought. It lies in what it revealed. The defenders succeeded because they learned. They studied past failures. They adapted. They acted with discipline. History often celebrates dramatic victories, but true success often comes from quieter strengths. Observation, patience, preparation. In the winter of 1288, these qualities made the difference. The Mongols came expecting fear. Instead, they found resistance. They faced an enemy that understood them. And because of that, the outcome changed. The invasion did not end in dominance. It ended in failure. And with it, the myth of unstoppable Mongol power began to fade.